Hello, everyone, and welcome to IPRI's podcast. Today, we're joined with Mr. Jamal Aziz, who is a recognized international law expert and has worked on a number of international law issues related to Pakistan for the past 10 years. He currently serves as the executive director of the Research Society of International Law, the oldest international legal think tank in Pakistan. Thank you, Jamal, for joining us
Thank
today.
you, ma'am. It's always a pleasure.
Jamal, we're here to talk today to talk about the FATF, Pakistan's role, and India's review that is coming up this year. So, to begin with, and for the clarity of our audience, can you tell us what the FATF is and how it has evolved over time?
Thanks, Maham. Thank you for the invitation. So the Financial Action Task Force is, a relatively new entrant into the global governance framework. It's been there since 1989, but its influence has grown considerably in the last 10 decades. Basically, it is, it's a watchdog that monitors, and terrorism financing and money laundering in jurisdictions worldwide. And what it does is that it sets standards, it sets broad standards and policies, and then it tells every country that according to its own domestic legal systems, whether that is, whatever the unique structures are, they have to implement those standards and policies. So it will tell every country that you need to know what the specific risk is of your jurisdiction to terrorism financing or money laundering. For example, Pakistan's risk to terrorism financing is very different than the risk in Switzerland, for example, right? The different systems, there might be Hawala Hundi risk over there and in formal banking channels in Switzerland, right? So you need to identify what the particular risk of your jurisdiction is, and then every jurisdiction is required to formulate policies and action plans and guidelines which tackle those risks. Every country is required to have laws that target terrorism financing and money laundering. Every country is required to coordinate efforts between the different stakeholders because the response to money laundering and terrorism financing requires a whole of nation and a multi-sectoral institutional response. You need to have a criminal justice response. You need to have a mechanism in which it can be detected in the financial systems. There needs to be mechanisms in which these things are detected in certain sectors which are non-financial but which have a high risk of money laundering, such as the real estate sector or gems and jewelers, or accountants or lawyers. So broadly speaking, FATF sets these broad recommendations, and it assesses countries on two factors. One is technical compliance. So that is a list of 40 recommendations, the famous 40 recommendations of FATF. And those say that, these are the legal, regulatory, technical things which every country is required to do. So that is mostly when FATF assesses you, it checks whether you have those laws and regulations on paper. Do you have an offense against money laundering? Do you have mechanisms for customer due diligence, etc., etc. And then more importantly, perhaps, FATF has an effectiveness assessment. So it says that, so that is judged by 11 immediate outcomes. So you have 40 technical recommendations, and then you have 11 immediate outcomes. And the immediate outcomes are the gist of it in layman terms is you might have all of these laws and policies on paper. Are they working? Are people actually understanding the risks? Are they being implemented? Are convictions taking place? Etc., etc. So that's broadly how FATF is. The reason why FATF has become so important is because its mandate has become intertwined with a patchwork of different international obligations. So UN Security Council resolutions exist, which now Chapter 7 resolutions, which require every country to abide by the FATF recommendations. The FATF has 39 full members, I believe nine associate bodies, and then 28 observer groups as well. So the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, different UN organizations are part of the observer group. So as a result, it is now a network, a multi-level network of countries, observer bodies, and the collective impact is quite formidable.
And dovetailing to this question, that Pakistan was under the FATF lens for quite some time, and then we saw Pakistan put on the grey list and taken off it. What are some of the successes that Pakistan has seen at FATF?
So Pakistan has had, initially I would say a checkered history with FATF. As like I mentioned in my first, in response to your first question, FATF has been evolving in the last 20 years, but the last 10 years it has really kind of picked up. Pakistan was grey listed three times. Once we were grey listed in, I believe it was around 2006 7. Back then it was a simple question that we did not have an effective anti-money laundering law, or we did not have a financial intelligence unit, so we made those changes and we got off the gray list. Then we got gray listed in 2012 to 2015. That was more again focusing on technical compliance issues. There were problems, deficiencies in our terrorism financing laws. But 2018 was a different ball game, and this time FATF, the assessment criteria. So FATF, an important point to notice that FATF is continuously revising its methodology. Right now, we are in the fourth evaluation phase, in which is based on a 2012 methodology, and it's very technical, so I won't go into that. But its methods on how it evaluates a country and its frameworks have become much more sophisticated. And so Pakistan was put under rigorous pressure in 2018 because there was a lot of deficiencies in our system. They said that you were not able to identify the risks. There were not enough, general actors in the public and private sector were not able to identify this issue. It was not something which was widely understood. Um and so we were given a big, long-standing action plan, which was, required a lot of action. And unfortunately, we saw that process also politicized. FATF, I personally think it is an exciting new area in which how compliance with international law can be sought. It can demand better compliance than perhaps treaties do. Uh,
Sure.
it's much more effective. But if you politicize it, as we saw, it was politicized when Pakistan was in the grey list. India, in particular, took that opportunity to really grill Pakistan at
Mm.
the different plenary sessions. It used its, membership of FATF and its structural power to kind of push us against the wall. And that kind of overt politicization is something which needs to be cautioned against, because it can actually undermine the credibility, the efficacy of these bodies. And now, as we are entering into this, open multipolar contestation, that is not good for the FATF's credibility. After the Ukraine war, also we saw Russia's membership suspended. These things don't augur well, in my view, in my personal view, for the credibility of these exciting new forums which can actually cause things. But coming to your question, Pakistan's story, despite the fact that we were, really in 2018, we were rated really poorly in the technical compliance, in the immediate term outcomes, we had really bad scores. I think we were non-compliant in 30 out of 40 of the technical recommendations, and I believe 9 or 10 of the immediate outcomes we were not. And within a span of 4 years, we saw a whole of nation response in which actors and regulators from across the board, whether it was the SECP or the state bank or the police departments, the home departments, all across the board, a whole of nation approach took place, and we were able to develop dozens of new laws, and not just and regulations. I believe there were 25 plus laws and 75 plus regulations that we enacted. But actors across the board, from the financial sector to designated non-financial sectors to the criminal justice sector, were able to rapidly develop indigenous capacity. So the fact that results started coming, and within 4 years, Pakistan was rated compliant on 38 out of 40, and I believe now we are compliant on all 40 of the technical recommendations. And the immediate outcomes effectiveness is scheduled in the coming months, and I think that's going to be also very positive. So overall, it is, I think, with the challenges that we face, general governance challenges, general capacity issues across the board, the fact that we were able to kind of unite on this, understand the implications and take it on, and shows, is a very welcome sign. It shows that we are taking our obligations seriously, um, and we are very keen to portray ourselves as a responsible state. And I think FATF, our whitelisting, is a colloquial term, is an example of this commitment.
Great. And so you spoke about India's role in FATF, particularly with regards to Pakistan. So India's own review is coming up this
Yeah.
year. And with that, what are some of the key issues or concerns that you see with India in their on site review this year?
So, India has not been reviewed by the FATF under the fourth round of evaluation of FATF, which was started in 2012. Like I said, India's last review by FATF took place in 2010, which was based under the old FATF methodology of 2004. So, in 2004, it was a very basic methodology. It did not look into it was not very um, wide ranging. It was just very basic kind of stuff. But and then India had a follow up report in 2013 which hit those methodologies. Now earlier on, uh, those reviews had kind of raised certain concerns with regards to preventive measures in the Indian financial sector as well. But generally speaking, that review also focused that India's domestic criminal justice system was not very tuned towards getting convictions under India's Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So it was not something which, even in their jurisdiction, it's not very common to see convictions for money laundering taking place. But coming to your question now, I think that in the past year or so, certain worrying developments, or I would say the last 2 or 3 years, certain worrying trends have emerged from India. And that is something which needs to be seen moving forward. There is a shadow report which has just come out. It was compiled by the Global NPO Coalition. If I would just read out some of the extracts of that, it has been shared with the FATF. Uh, that shows that there is willful support of the Indian government to extreme right elements in India which are linked with terrorism financing. I'd like to read. The report particularly highlights how Hindutva groups receive financial support from extremist organizations through a complex web of transactions masquerading as charitable work. The supporting organizations are spread over continents and have clandestinely provided financial support to Hindutva groups through covert methods. Sometimes the financial support to Hindutva groups have been through overt and legal financial institutions because the government has failed to put a check on such flow of funds. The findings of the report show the financial support of the Hindutva group is on the rise and has a direct bearing on the growth of Hindutva groups and their operations. The double standards of the Indian government in selectively targeting civil society actors and shielding Hindutva terror groups violates India's promise of complying with FATF standards and preventing the risk of terrorism financing. So I would say that this is quite a damning indication. Now, whether this is, whether the on-site report, corresponds with this remains to be seen. So this is one area of concern. Another area of concern which has been highlighted in the Indian press and also by an Amnesty report which has just come out recently as well is how India is misusing its AML CFT laws to crack down on NPOs, non-profit organizations, especially those which are working on human rights issues, human rights reporting. We have seen, India massively rejecting, canceling licensing. I believe almost 20 to 22,000 licenses have been cancelled in recent years as well. So that is something which has been highlighted by Amnesty and Indian groups as well, Indian media, and because the FATF methodology is, you're not supposed to use it for, suppressing dissent and these issues as well. So this is something which needs to be seen. Another issue, which is again, through secondary sources, we can only say, but the Adani group, which is closely linked to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there have been many allegations of how that group has been involved in, money laundering, suspicions of money laundering activities around the world. And India's regulators, especially the Securities and Exchange Board, has not given it the kind of thorough investigation. Really, they've given it a very kind of relaxed treatment, that is something which FATF regulators, FATF on-site experts are going to kind of. I think they'll be scrutinizing that quite carefully, because FATF on-site groups are also based their initial investigations on secondary reports. So what is being reported in the Indian press in these international reports is definitely something which will be in the radar as well. Then going back 2 3 years, if you would remember, the international consortiums of investigative journalists had issued a report which was based on leaks from the U.S. Treasury Department's FinCEN. The FinCEN is
Links, yeah.
the financial intelligence unit of the United States. That report back then had highlighted also how correspondent banks dealing with Indian banks, foreign correspondent banks like Deutsche Bank and others, which were dealing with India, saw between 2011 and 2017 there were there were thousands of suspicious transaction reports issued which involved over $1 billion. Now, suspicious transaction reports by themselves are not indicative, they're not conclusive evidence of wrongdoing. But when there is such a pattern and there's so many of them, there's so many, that shows that India's financial system and its banks, those processes will have to be reviewed. And that is something which FATF is also going to look into, how the regulation is done by the Indian banks with regards to AML, CFT as well. And finally, I would also say that, FATF also looks at proliferation financing. So, financing of, uh, things which can contribute to the production of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. That is something which is high on the FATF priority. FATF recommendation 7 looks at that. And as we have seen in recent years, a lot of news stories coming out of how uranium has been, being traded in the Indian open market. Different, high quantities, 7 kgs, 6 kgs of uraniums have been found and busted by, Indian police. That is something which I think also requires careful evaluation of how Indian frameworks that target proliferation financing will also come under scrutiny.
And just carrying on from that question about weapons and financing, there's a lot of speculation surrounding India and the financing of terrorism. How do you see India's actions failing with with the current review? We've seen a number of situations where India has been alleged to be using terror financing in other sovereign states.
I mean, this is something which it's definitely a worrying development. Look, Pakistan has been arguing for years, has been for many years that India has been involved in sponsoring terrorism attacks in Pakistan. The evidence for that is now incontrovertible. Whether it was the PC Gwadar attack or the stock exchange attack or the model town attacks, uh, are what has so we know that India has been involved in those attacks in Pakistan. But when those attacks used to take place, we did ourselves did not understand how, we were not very well versed in how to investigate terrorism financing. Um but I think a silver line of Pakistan's grey listing has been that since we have developed this indigenous capacity of how to trace monies and how to, empower the relevant departments, I think that now our evidence collection with regards to this will improve, um, and we will be able to give much better and more defining evidences with regards to these issues as well. uh, Again, Pakistan needs to focus on, if I'm just talking about Pakistan right now, I'll talk about other countries as well. uh, Pakistan needs to focus on improving its mutual legal assistance frameworks. It needs to become a member of the Egmont Group, which is the group of FIUs all over the world, financial intelligence units. It's unexplainable why we're not a part of it right now. I think global politics also plays a role. I think Afghanistan's Fintraka is on in the FIU group, but our FMU is not in it, which is quite strange. But I think efforts are being made to go into that. Once you become part of those networks, you're able to share financial evidence much better. And I think that needs to be done more. I think with regards to India's generally, this doctrine of having involved in doing these clandestine illegal operations on foreign soil, now we are seeing that expanding. The best, in Canada, the Harpreet Singh case is an manifestation of that. I believe in the Gulf also some Indian spies have now been caught, I believe in Qatar.
Qatar,
uh,
yes.
so these things show that there's a doctrine behind this, and more countries are now going to be focusing on how were these operations financed. That's going to be a key element. But I think intelligence, converting intelligence into evidence, that is something which all jurisdictions abroad focus on. That in Canada you're seeing that it's all based on intelligence evidence that a domestic criminal investigation is taking
Yeah.
place. uh, where we have not been able to argue effectively is because our criminal justice system is still focused on, a 19th century in procedure. and those have to be updated so that intelligence evidence through proper safeguards and due process can become admissible in court. I think once we start doing that, we'll be able to prove much bigger link as well. Just as a final point, the dossier that we released in 2020 of Indian
Okay. Yeah.
sponsored terrorism, that had evidences, receipts of $28,000 sent by the Punjab National Bank in India to Afghanistan, which was then traced to attacks in Pakistan, right? But this was, how do you structure this legally? How do you make it admissible? How do you,
Put it
develop
in
a
front
case,
of FATF.
put in
Yeah.
front of FATF? These things need to, we need to work on that better so that these things become, they develop more, evidence grade. They become of evidence grade. And that Punjab National Bank, incidentally, was then also mentioned as one of the banks with, serious, in which a lot of suspicious transaction reports were noted in the FinCEN leaks as well. So there
Okay.
is a pattern. We need to do better engagement. We need to do. It's a long process, but I think that India, there are there is now a lot of these different evidences to show that um, India's FATF review requires careful scrutiny.
And you spoke about better engagement with the international community, which brings me on to my last question is, moving forward, where do you see FATF going, considering we now live in a world that is so polarized that buying into a multilateral system is something that states really have to be convinced about? So in light of that, where do you see FATF, like, in the
That's a very
future?
good question.
Yeah.
I think that FATF has been very innovative in, and has been done a very good job in constantly reinventing itself. It was meant to be initially a task force that dealt only with money laundering. Then it expanded to terrorism financing, then to proliferation financing. Then it continuously revised its methodology, upgraded its membership. And the interesting thing is that uh, FATF's membership is growing, and we are seeing a lot of global South countries become part of FATF in
Yeah.
recent years. Obviously, there are certain, and there is no, if you go on FATF's website or these different pages, there's no criteria by which you can, follow this to become FATF members. So that it's still a very political process, but obviously you have to be a jurisdiction which has, certain financial, heft. Then you need to have stringent, you need to pass the internal checks of FATF, these MERs and ratings. You have to be highly compliant to be members now in today's world. Earlier, if you became members perhaps in 2004 or 3, it was a different ball game. But now, if you have to be a member, you have to pass. And I think a lot of global South countries, Indonesia has become a member this year. Saudi Arabia became a member earlier as well. Mexico, South Africa, Malaysia. So these things show that there is more global South representation coming in. FATF is going to change its methodology from, I believe, from next year or the year after that. We're going to move into the fifth evaluation round,
Okay.
and the fifth evaluation round is much more stringent. It will be only now. Currently, FATF has a 10-year loop in which it reviews you, and then there's a 10-year loop before it repeats itself. Now there's going to be a 6-year loop. This things that, and it's going to focus on effectiveness. So they're going to keep coming back to Pakistan. Just because we're off the white list, doesn't, we're off the gray list, doesn't mean that we can just relax. These things are going to, these frameworks are going to get more and more complex. They're going to get more and more demanding. But hopefully they will be, the standards will be uniformly applied. What we have to push back against is politicization, bias. Pakistan's action plan was the most rigorous of any action plan ever given to any country, right? These are things which we need to kind of question. Why was this done? What was the impact? What are the, and push back against, because like I mentioned in the beginning, FATF can do wonders, and it can, these kind of models, if they are removed from politicization and there is lessened bias, you can use kind of these frameworks for climate change, for health security, for these different issues. But if it fails because of polarization and because of politicization, then I think it will be a collective loss to the global community, and the 30 years of efforts that have gone into making it the organization it is today would be undone by short termism.
Thank you, Jamal, and thank you for joining us for our podcast today. We look forward to seeing you in our future podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.